The Holy Gospel comes from the 8th chapter of Mark. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say I am?" And they answered, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed. And after 3 days, rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with the disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can be given in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord. You may be seated. Well, one of the books I read on sabbatical was called Love is the Way. It's written by the bishop of the Episcopal Church, Bishop Michael Curry. And in the book, Bishop Curry says that the opposite of love is not hate, it's selfishness. He says, if love looks outward to the good of the other, then its opposite isn't hate, its opposite is selfishness. Selfishness is the most destructive force in all the cosmos, and hate is only its symptom. Selfishness really is the definition of sin. There's this Latin phrase that theologians of old like to use called curvatus in se. It's this turning inward on oneself. It's like belly button gazing, where one thinks of themselves, their needs, their desires before others. That is sin. So to Bishop Curry's point, the opposite of selfishness, this turned inward, is being turned outward in love toward the good of another, to the good of our neighbor, to the common good. Jesus was all about this kind of love. In fact, he'd give his life in service to this kind of love and for the good of the world. So in the gospel, where we're at is kind of right in the middle of the gospel, and it's kind of this point where things start to get real. Things get more dramatic and more tense for Jesus. Back in Jesus' day, they were, of course, under Roman occupation. And the Jewish people had this hope that their kingdom of Israel could be restored. But they lived under the Romans. And for those living under that oppression, there were two ways they thought to deal with this. One, just go with the status quo, don't disturb anything, keep the peace. And the other was to revolt, to overthrow the Romans with military might and make this kingdom come. Jesus, however, presents a third way, a third option. Jesus shows this third way that is characterized by love and by grace and by truth. And it's what made him so dangerous to the status quo and to those who wanted to revolt. It made him dangerous to religious leaders and Roman leaders. And I tend to think that if Jesus came today, he would feel dangerous to us as well, to the status quo and to those who want to revolt, to Christian leaders and to political leaders. Yeah, I think Jesus would feel dangerous to us. Now, Peter had these big messianic hopes for Jesus. So when Peter confesses that Jesus is the Messiah, he is both right and he is wrong. Jesus is the Messiah. He is the anointed one. Messiah means anointed. But where he's wrong is in that expectations of what a Messiah should be. Jesus wasn't going to be a king in the traditional sense, and he wasn't going to lead a military revolt. I don't think we can be too hard on Peter for that. After all, King David, he was a Messiah. He was an anointed one. He was a political leader of the nation of Israel. And then there was Cyrus of Persia, who the Bible talks about as also being anointed. He was a chosen one of God that helped come free the Israelites from Babylon's rule, and they got to return home. So both these are political leaders. So Peter isn't wrong, really, in his expectation of what a Messiah would be. It's just it didn't match what Jesus was about. Jesus had something entirely different in mind, and it was about changing the world with love. After Jesus challenges Peter, for Peter challenging Jesus, he calls together the disciples and the crowd. And he tells them, he talks about taking up the cross and losing their lives for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of love. If they seek to save their life by focusing on themselves, that looking at their own belly button, their own needs and wants and desires, then that's how they'll lose their life. For Jesus, this third way of love wasn't giving in to the status quo when it wasn't taking up weapons for violence, but opening hands and hearts to the world, to the neighbor, to those in need. It was participating in this kingdom of God that would be so radically characterized by love and the common good and the health and wholeness of all that would change the world. And that was what was threatening to human ways of thinking and being. But it was central to Jesus, and that's why he would be killed. But Jesus lives what he preaches. And his call to follow this way of love and self-sacrifice and grace and truth rings true for us today. Now, Michael Curry in his book says that if it is about love, then it is about God. And if it is about God, then it is about love. So one of the stories that I encountered over the past couple of weeks was in a 9/11 documentary, National Geographic's 9/11 documentary on Hulu. And I was watching the first episode, and if you've watched it, I'm hoping I'm representing the story pretty close. There was one man whose story stood out to me. He had to go to, I can't remember if it was the World Trade Center or the Marriott on 9/11 for a meeting. And he got dressed up for this meeting because it was important and he was nervous about it. He wore his good suit and he wore a yellow tie. When he got on the ferry that day, someone even said that he looked really sharp. He was ready for this day. And he was there when the first tower was hit. He was bewildered as he walked through, the dust, the plume of dust and smoke. And at one point, he met a woman who was badly burned. The burns were evident on the front of her body, and her eyes were fused shut, probably from an explosion that had filled the elevator shaft. She was afraid. She was afraid that she was dying. She was in extraordinary pain. She couldn't see where she was going. And this man with the yellow tie stood by her side. He keeps recounting the stories. Finally, they kind of leave the building and make their way out. And a first responder kind of tells them to keep going, get out of there quickly. And he leads the woman on the way. Eventually, they get to an ambulance, and he's able to hand the woman over to the EMTs. And just as he's recounting at this part of the story, on the screen comes a picture of a man with a yellow tie, his arm around a woman who looks badly burned. And he goes on to tell his story of how then he leaned over to wish the woman well. And at that point, on the screen comes the video footage of a man in a yellow tie leaning over to wish the woman well. And she's carried off and cared for in the ambulance. That man, on a morning filled with fear and uncertainty, chose a way of love. And if it's about love, then it is about God. And if it is about God, then it is about love. In the book, Michael Curry says, love is a verb. It's an action. It's a force when followed through. Love is a commitment to seek the good and to work for good in the welfare of others. It doesn't stop at our front door or in our neighborhood, our religion or our race or our state or our country's border. It's often what calls us to step outside what we thought our boundaries were or what others expect of us. It calls for us to sacrifice, not because doing so feels good, but because it's the right thing to do. I think we're in this midst of a real struggle now, as we've been dealing with this prolonged experience of the pandemic. I think there's unprocessed emotions and feelings that are like spewing out sideways and in ugly ways. I was at a meeting with other clergy earlier this week, and they talked about the anger and the anxiety in their congregations that were causing things to implode or explode. There were real struggles. And I remember talking to someone who works at the Village earlier in the summer. She said that Lamonters are being weird. They're calling about things they've never called about before. They're not nice. They're like, there's just this anxiety and tension that she talked about hearing over the phone. We've had rallies, protests in our town about wearing masks in school or not, or people wanting that choice for their children. It's been at our school board meetings. And then there was the fight over the mascot for Lamont High. But to be clear, loving our neighbor is wearing a mask, and it's getting vaccinated. Loving our neighbor is listening and honoring Native Americans, not in costume or logo, but in respecting their legacy. This time is filled with tension and anxiety, and now uncertainty as we look forward and we feel like we're moving backwards instead of forwards. And all the feelings can come out sideways or in ugly ways. But as people of faith, we turn to God. We come together as community. We share in community. We listen to what God has to speak to us and to us in this moment. And Jesus was bold enough to believe that love could change the world. And right now, I think the church and Jesus' way of love is needed for the healing of everyone. Dr. Martin Luther King gave 10 commandments for nonviolence. The 10th commandment, what I want to talk about, was specific to marching, but the other 9 give these practical ways to ground ourselves and root ourselves in love so that we can show up to be love in the world. 1, meditate daily on the teachings and the life of Jesus. 2, remember always that the nonviolent movement seeks justice and reconciliation, not victory. Walk and talk in the manner of love, for God is love. Pray daily to be used by God in order that all might be free. Sacrifice personal wishes in order that all might be free. In other words, we'll stop looking at our belly buttons and look out to the neighbor and to the world. Observe with both friend and foe the ordinary rules of courtesy. Seek to perform regular service for others and for the world. We're going to work out that love muscle. Refrain from violence of fist, of tongue, or heart. And strive to be in good bodily and spiritual health so we can take care of ourselves, so we can show up with love for another. Jesus' third way of love leads us forward. It's not returning violence for violence, and it's not just succumbing to the status quo, because for some, the status quo is not safe. Jesus' way of love turns us toward our neighbor with open hands and open hearts. It's losing our lives for the sake of love and absolutely finding them in God's grace. Jesus lived what he preached, and in the end, it cost him his life. But even so, in his resurrection, God reveals that love wins. Always. Thanks be to God. Amen.